Hey, hello everyone. So in this session, we are going to understand what is the Linux booting process, a typical Linux booting process, which is, a very important topic. There are stages of Linux booting process. So first stage is something which is BIOS or firmware. BIOS stands for Basic Input Output System. So let's understand what is BIOS. Okay, in the Linux booting process, there are certain stages which we are going to discuss. When you press the power on button, after that, what is happening till you get the login screen, that is what the entire booting process is all about. So let's understand this. So the first stage of the Linux booting process is BIOS or firmware, which is basic input output system. And this is like waking up the computer. When you press the power button, the BIOS or firmware wakes up and starts the boot process. So it performs a power on self test, that is post, to check if all hardware components are working properly. Then it looks for the boot device, typically the hard drive, to find the bootloader. So usually if you go back and see your machine where you have provision, on the virtual box, I would say. So here we have, the Oracle VM virtual box where we have provisioned the Linux machine, and in this particular machine you will see that there are certain settings where you will see this particular OS is configured. So for example, if I go to the system, and you will see that the hard disk is also attached, and which is a part of a boot order. So first is a floppy disk, then optical drive, that is CD or DVD, and then third is hard disk. So usually what happens when you press the power on button, the BIOS executes and it checks for the bootable device, which is mentioned in this particular order. So if floppy is not attached, okay, it will just pass that stage. If CD or DVD is not attached, it will pass that stage. And then the next is the hard disk where our operating system is installed. So this particular stage where BIOS look for the bootable device, and it check for the bootloader program and passes control to it. So let's understand that. So this is the virtual machine configuration, and here we can see that particular boot order. All right. So to find the bootloader means this particular bootloader program resides on the first boot device, which is mentioned in the BIOS configuration. That is what we understood. The next stage of this Linux booting process is bootloader program. So grub is a very popular, most of the Linux operating system is having the grub bootloader program. So during the installation only, this program get installed on your first sector of your hard disk, which is nothing but your master boot record, which we have discussed in the previous session. So think of this as the bouncer at the entrance of a club. It's like a menu that lets you choose which operating system you want to boot into. Grub loads the Linux kernel into memory. It's like inviting the main actor onto the stage. So grub is a bootloader program which is installed on a master boot record. Master boot record is also referred to the first sector of your hard disk, and bootloader program is installed on that particular sector, and it actually looks for the kernel and passes control to it. So it executes the kernel and passes control to it. So this is the second stage where grub loads the Linux kernel into memory. The third stage, once the grub loads the Linux kernel into memory, the third stage comes, which is Linux kernel. So now the main show begins. The kernel is the core of the operating system. As you know, Linux kernel is the main program. Usually, sometimes you are not able to understand what exactly mean of the kernel. So kernel is a big program. It's a software, right, which drives the entire operating system operations. Is it interacts with your hardware, all the peripherals attached to your computer. It interacts with the the terminals, the shell, and it is the program which is heart of your operating system. So it initializes devices like a CPU, memory, and storage drives. It's like setting up the stage, lights, and sound system. So it's responsible for managing hardware resources and starting essential system services. So when the kernel stage comes, right, it's basically executes all the required services, or it passes the control and it checks for all the hardware resources, and then it you know uh, passes control to the next system. The next stage of this particular booting process is init RAM-FS, which is initial RAM file system. So this is a temporary file system loaded into memory by the kernel during the boot up. So it contains essential drivers and tools needed to mount the root file system. So as in the Linux kernel stage, it's basically check and all the hardware resources, starting essential system services, and then it mounts the temporary root file system. Okay, it's like the backstage area where actors prepare before going on stage. Here the system gets ready to load the real root file system. So as you see in Linux, for the installation we understood that there is a partition called slash. Slash is the root file system, which is the main file system under which all the other system folders and files or file system structure is resides. So when the Linux kernel passes or mount the temporary root, file system, and then it loads the real root file system in the fourth stage, that is init RAM-FS. The next stage of this Linux booting process is mounting the root file system. So once the temporary root file system is mounted, the next is now the kernel mounts the actual root file system where the core operating system files are stored. It's like the actors finally stepping onto the main stage. The root file system contains everything needed for the systems to function. So as you see the login prompt which we get, or maybe the services which we are able to see, whatever those programs or services which we are able to see in the front end, that is because the root file system is now mounted where all the file system structure is located. So entire directory structure is now available for the use. So this is the fifth stage where the root file system is getting mounted. The next stage is init process. So the init process managed by systemd on a modern Linux system. So in Rocky Linux, you will find that as a systemd. And it takes over and is the first process started by the Linux kernel. It's like the director of the show, coordinating all other processes. It initializes system services and user space processes, bringing the systems to fully operational state. Once the init process completes its task, the system is ready for you to interact with, like the curtain rising and then start of the performance. So you got the login shell, you are logging into the system, and then you are executing the commands or you are doing further operations. So that is what the last stage of this particular booting process happens. So as we understood, there are 6 stages, the typical booting stages, where the it starts from the BIOS, and then from the power on self test, it's actually check the hardware compatibility, the integrity of the hardware in this particular stage, and look for the bootloader program, and then passes control to it. Then bootloader program is nothing but your grub, which is installed or located on the first sector of your hard disk, which is also called as the master boot record, and then it looks for the kernel and passes control to it. So now this particular kernel which executes or responsible for managing the hardware resources and starting the essential system services. So it initializes devices like CPU, memory, storage, and it's mount the temporary root file system. So after temporary root file system mounting, which is done by the fourth stage, that is init RAM-FS, right, the next stage is responsible to mount the main root file system. So then the kernel mounts the actual root file systems where the core operating system files are stored, and then it passes control to the next stage. So init process, after that, once the root file system is mounted, init is the first process which is executed by the Linux kernel, which is responsible to start the other required services or bringing the systems to a fully operational state. So this is how the Linux booting process works. So when you see on this particular VM, I'll just close it, and if I restart this particular machine, so you will notice that this is the stage, this is the screen which is given by the grub bootloader, okay, and then it started certain services. You can see that, you will notice that started, some services are getting up, and then finally you got the login screen. So it's very quick actually, and on the systems it happens very quick. So BIOS, then grub, then kernel, then init ram fs, then init process, and that is how it works. So in the next session we will see how Linux shell looks like, and what is the use of Linux shell, how it works, what are the different features of the Linux shell. So in this session we understood the Linux booting process, and there are 6 stages which we discuss. So see you in the next session. Thanks a lot.